Hubby took all of our money and sent me a message from the airport flying to Rome with my lover. Have fun being poor. I calmly replied, maybe you should talk to the police officer who followed you first. I was waiting outside. I stared at the message on my phone, a faint smile playing at my lips despite the gravity of the situation. Flying to Rome with my lover. Have fun being poor. James's last taunt glowed mockingly on the screen. Oh, if he only knew. My name is Natalie, and at 29, I never expected to be tracking my husband's attempted escape through JFK Airport while coordinating with an international task force. But here I was, parked outside the terminal, watching the operation unfold through the feeds on my laptop. The irony was almost poetic. James thought he was being clever, draining what he believed were our personal accounts. He had no idea those accounts were actually fronts we'd set up weeks ago when we first caught wind of his embezzlement scheme. As Senior Vice President of Finance at Morton & Blake Investment Group, my husband had been systematically stealing millions from client accounts for months. He thought he was untouchable, brilliant even. That arrogance would be his downfall. I'd known something was off for weeks. The late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in our financial arrangements. When I discovered the first traces of suspicious transfers, I didn't confront him. Instead, I took my evidence straight to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. That's when Agent Catherine Torres entered our lives, though James knew her only as Amanda, the gorgeous new client who seemed so interested in both our investment services and him personally. Target is approaching security checkpoint. Agent Torres's voice crackled through my earpiece. He's with the female operative now. I watched through the camera feed as James strutted through the terminal, his arm around the waist of who he thought was his mistress. He had no idea she was one of our best undercover agents, or that every step he took was being monitored by a dozen law enforcement officers. Remember, I spoke softly into my mic. He's likely carrying the backup drive with all the transaction records. Don't let him dump it. Copy that, came the response. The pieces were all in place. Now it was just a matter of watching my husband's grandiose escape plan crumble around him. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Looking back, I should have seen the signs sooner. 6 months ago when James started pushing me to combine all our accounts, I'd assumed it was about trust and marriage. He'd presented it so convincingly over dinner at our favorite restaurant. His brown eyes earnest as he talked about building our future together. I was touched by his apparent desire for transparency, never suspecting it was all part of his plan to gain access to everything. But James didn't know that my background in forensic accounting wasn't just a line on my resume. Before joining Morton & Blake, I'd spent 3 years tracking down corporate fraud schemes. The skills never quite leave you. The attention to detail, the ability to spot patterns and financial discrepancies, the instinct for recognizing when something just doesn't add up. The first red flag was the change in his routine. James had always been methodical, leaving for work at exactly 7:30 a.m. and returning by 6 p.m. Then suddenly, he started having emergency client meetings that kept him at the office until midnight. I might have believed it, except I caught him slipping once. His urgent client call showed a Dubai area code at 3 a.m. their time. The second warning came from his newfound interest in our home security system. He insisted on upgrading everything, adding cameras and motion sensors. At the time, I praised his attention to our safety. Now I realize he was paranoid about being watched himself, especially in his home office where he did most of his illegal transfers. Our account manager called. He'd mentioned casually last week. She suggested we diversify some investments. I'll handle everything. The confidence in his voice almost masked his nervousness. Almost. That's when I contacted Agent Torres. Within hours, we had a plan in motion. The FBI had already been investigating a series of suspicious international transfers from Morton & Blake, but they needed solid evidence linking it to someone inside. I could provide that connection. I'm doing this for us, James had whispered this morning as he kissed me goodbye, thinking I was still asleep. We'll have everything we ever dreamed of. If he only knew that his dreams of escape were about to turn into his worst nightmare. My phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was a photo. James at a champagne bar in the terminal, toasting with the woman he thought was his mistress. Thanks for making this so easy, he wrote. BTW. I took a little extra from your personal emergency fund. Consider it payment for 5 years of pretending to love you. The words hit harder than I expected. Even knowing what kind of man he truly was, even after discovering his crimes, something about that casual cruelty made my chest tighten. I thought about the night we met, both new employees at Morton & Blake, sharing takeout Chinese food during late-night training sessions. I remembered how he'd brought me soup when I had the flu, how he'd held my hand at my father's funeral. Had it all been an act? Target is getting restless, Agent Torres reported through my earpiece. He's checked his watch 3 times in the last minute. I pulled up the security feed from the terminal. James was trying to look relaxed, but I could read the tension in his shoulders. He kept glancing at his phone, probably checking the time until his flight. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He was carrying my father's vintage leather briefcase, the one I'd inherited after Dad passed away. The realization sparked something in me. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about every lie, every manipulation, every moment he'd used my trust against me. I thought about the clients whose lives he'd potentially ruined, the families whose savings he'd stolen, all while playing the role of devoted husband. Agent Torres, I spoke into my mic, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my throat. The evidence is in my father's briefcase. He always said it was the safest place to keep important documents. Knowing James, he's using it to transport the backup drive and any incriminating papers. Copy that, she responded. We'll make sure to secure it. I watched as James checked his phone again, his expression growing more anxious. He had no idea that his mistress had already alerted airport security about a suspicious package, ensuring they'd be pulled aside for additional screening. He didn't know that we'd frozen the accounts he thought he'd drained. He was probably wondering why his Rome-bound flight was mysteriously delayed. Time to end this charade. I picked up my phone and typed out one final message. Maybe you should talk to the police officer behind you first. Through the security camera feed, I watched James's face transform as he read my message. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of panic as he spun around. The police officer wasn't actually behind him, not yet, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was guilty, and he knew he was in trouble. All units in position, Agent Torres's voice crackled in my earpiece. We've got eyes on all exits. James was moving now, walking briskly toward the international terminal. My father's briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. His mistress kept pace beside him, one hand casually resting on his arm. I knew she was making sure he couldn't bolt. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered, keeping my eyes fixed on the security feed. Your little game stops now. James's voice was cold, controlled. I've got copies of every transaction you've ever signed off on. If I go down, you're coming with me. I felt a chill run down my spine. He was bluffing. He had to be. I'd been careful documenting everything since I first suspected his scheme, but there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. Really? I kept my voice steady. And what transactions would those be? Don't play innocent, Natalie. Those offshore accounts? The shell companies? I've got proof you were involved from the beginning. Who do you think they'll believe? The devoted husband trying to protect his wife's interests, or the scorned woman seeking revenge? My heart raced. He was trying to twist this around, make me look like the guilty one. Classic James. Always manipulating the situation to his advantage. But he'd made one crucial mistake. Interesting theory, I replied. Have you shared this evidence with Amanda? There was a pause. Through the camera feed, I saw him glance at the woman beside him. What does she have to do with this? Everything. I allowed myself a small smile. You see, Agent Torres has been very interested in hearing about those offshore accounts. The color drained from his face. On the screen, I watched him take a step back from his companion, realization dawning in his eyes. But it was too late. In one fluid motion, she had his arm behind his back. James Anderson, you're under arrest for embezzlement and corporate fraud, she announced, her voice carrying across the terminal as other agents moved in. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. James started laughing. Oh, Natalie, he said into the phone, his voice full of mockery despite his position. You really think this is over? Check your email. I just sent you something interesting from the corporate server. Turns out your father wasn't as clean as you thought he was. The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty palm. With trembling fingers, I opened my email. There it was. A folder labeled Thomas Bennett Project Files. My father's name. I clicked it open and my world shifted beneath my feet. The documents filled my screen. Transaction records, emails, meeting minutes, all dating back to when my father was CFO at Morton & Blake 15 years ago. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. Project files showed systematic manipulation of accounts, carefully hidden beneath layers of legitimate transactions. The pattern was familiar because it was the exact same method James had been using. Natalie, Agent Torres's voice cut through my haze. We've got him secured, but he's demanding to speak with his lawyer before he knew, I interrupted, my voice barely a whisper. All this time, James knew about my father's involvement. That's why he chose me. That's why he pushed so hard to work at Morton & Blake. Through the terminal security feed, I could see James being led away by agents, that smug smile still playing on his lips. He'd known this moment was coming. Even in handcuffs, he had an ace up his sleeve. Your father's case was before my time, Agent Torres said cautiously. What exactly are we looking at? I quickly forwarded her the files. James didn't create this embezzlement scheme. He found my father's old blueprint and expanded on it. The offshore accounts? The shell companies. Dad built the foundation 15 years ago. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every memory of my father, His integrity, his principles, the lessons he'd taught me about right and wrong, now seemed tainted. Had James been watching me all these years, waiting for the perfect moment to use this information? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I've got more files, much more. Drop the charges or everything about Thomas Bennett goes public. Your choice, darling." I felt sick. James had orchestrated this perfectly. If the truth about my father came out, it wouldn't just destroy his legacy. It would implicate dozens of current Morton and Blake executives who had worked alongside him. The scandal would devastate the firm and everyone connected to it. "He's trying to leverage this, isn't he?" Agent Torres asked, reading my silence. "Yes," I admitted, "but he's made one critical mistake." I pulled up the original files my father had left me. The ones stored in an encrypted drive I'd found after his death. James didn't know about these, couldn't know about them. Dad had documented everything, including the names of those who had forced him into the scheme. "My father wasn't the mastermind," I said, my voice growing stronger. "He was the whistleblower, and I can prove it." The pieces were falling into place now. Dad hadn't been able to come forward before his death, but he'd left everything I needed to finish what he'd started. James had only seen half the story, the part that looked incriminating. He had no idea he just handed me the key to exposing the entire corruption ring at Morton and Blake. I rushed to my office at Morton and Blake, Agent Torres following close behind. The building was nearly empty at this hour, but I knew exactly where to look. My father's old office, now a storage room, held the final piece of evidence we needed. "Your father suspected this might happen," I explained as we descended to the basement level. "He left me a series of clues in his personal journals. I never understood them until now." The storage room was cluttered with old filing cabinets and forgotten furniture. In the corner stood my father's ancient desk, deemed too heavy to move. I ran my fingers along its underside, finding the hidden catch he described in his journals. With a click, a small compartment opened. "Got it," I breathed, pulling out a weathered USB drive. "Miss Bennett," a voice called from the doorway. We turned to find Harold Wright, Morton and Blake's current CEO, watching us with cold eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to the company." 2 security guards flanked him. This wasn't good. "Actually," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "this belongs to the FBI now." I handed the drive to Agent Torres, who quickly secured it. Wright's facade cracked slightly. "You're making a serious mistake, Natalie. Think about your career, your reputation, your father's legacy." "My father's legacy?" I felt a surge of anger. "You mean the legacy you and the board created when you forced him to participate in your scheme? When you threatened to destroy him if he didn't help hide your fraud?" Wright's expression darkened. "You can't prove any of that." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and played a recording. My father's voice, weak but clear, documenting every detail of the board's corruption in his final days. Dad may not have lived to testify, but he made sure the truth would come out. Wright lunged for Agent Torres, but the security guards, who I now realize were actually FBI agents, grabbed him first. As they led him away in handcuffs, I noticed James being escorted through the lobby below. Their eyes met, and I watched the color drain from my husband's face as he realized his powerful allies couldn't help him anymore. "Your father would be proud," Agent Torres said softly. I nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm me. The evidence on that drive would expose decades of corruption at Morton and Blake, clearing my father's name and bringing down everyone involved in the scheme. James had thought he was so clever, using my father's past against me, but he'd never understood what kind of man Thomas Bennett really was. My phone buzzed. Another message from James. "We can still work this out. I'll tell them everything about your father's involvement." I smiled as I typed my response. "Go ahead. The whole truth is exactly what I want them to hear." The next morning, I sat in the FBI's Manhattan office watching the dominoes fall. On multiple screens, news channels broadcast the same story. Massive fraud scheme exposed at Morton and Blake, CEO and executives arrested. Agent Torres handed me a coffee as we watched the coverage. 17 arrests so far, she reported. "Your father's evidence was bulletproof. The encrypted timestamps proved the board's manipulation of his original reports. They can't claim he was acting alone." James appeared on one screen being led into court. His designer suit was wrinkled, his confident smirk replaced by a look of defeat. The reporter's voice cut through the room. "James Anderson, along with CEO Harold Wright, faces multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement. Sources say the scheme dates back 15 years with recent evidence revealing attempted whistleblowing by former CFO Thomas Bennett." "Your father's name has been cleared," Agent Torres said softly. I nodded, emotion tightening my throat. Dad had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, carefully documenting the corruption while appearing to play along. He'd known the evidence would eventually surface. He just hadn't lived to see it happen. An email arrived from James's lawyer. "My client wishes to convey the following message. You've ruined everything. I hope you're satisfied." I smiled as I drafted my response. Please inform your client that he ruined everything himself. And, yes, I'm satisfied. Justice has finally been served. 1 month later, I sat in the courtroom as the judge delivered the sentences. James's face remained emotionless as he heard the verdict. 20 years for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. Harold Wright and the other executives received similar sentences. The corruption at Morton & Blake had been completely exposed, and the firm was undergoing a total restructuring under new leadership. The federal investigation had recovered most of the stolen funds. The money would be returned to the affected clients, along with compensation from the firm's insurance. My father's detailed records had made this possible, his final gift to the people he tried to protect. After the sentencing, Agent Torres approached me with an unexpected offer. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division could use someone with your skills, she said. Someone who understands how these schemes work from the inside. Would you be interested in consulting for us? I thought about my father, about how he'd fought to expose the truth while protecting his family. I thought about all the other companies where similar frauds might be happening, other families who might be suffering. Yes, I replied, I would. As I left the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. My father's name had been cleared, justice had been served, and I had found a new purpose. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making sure the truth finally comes to light.